support for democracy in South Africa. Only 22% of those asked are supporting a democratic system. This displeasure, of course, is affecting the hegemonial party, ANC, which might lose its majority in parliament. In this election, I read over 50 parties competing. Israel is not a record holder of a multi-party system, and probably South Africa will move into coalition politics, which has its own problems. In terms of foreign policy, South Africa became closer to the anti-American actors. It is a founding member of the BRICS bloc, and I think the question that our panel will obviously address is, will the elections bring a change in the trajectory of South Africa? I transfer now the gavel to Shiri Fein-Grossman, the head of strategy and operations at the Israel Africa Institute. Shiri, it's your floor now.
Thank you so much, Professor Inbar, for this great introduction. I think you touched upon most of the subject we're going to cover in this fascinating webinar with top analysts we got from both South Africa, US, and Israel. For those who are not familiar with the Institute, I understand why. We are very new. We were founded earlier this year by Chaim Taib. And the CEO is Dr. Ayman Mansour. Both Ayman and I served for many years in the National Security Council and view Africa and Israel's relations with Africa as one of the most strategic aspects Israel has in its foreign policy, or more correct, should have. And the Institute was founded in order to build bridges, and the foundations for those bridges, in our point of view, is knowledge. And we start today with our first webinar, essentially, in the most important, I think, one of the most important, if not the most important country in the continent, South Africa, one of the most important trade partner Israel has in the continent. And of course, what you see lately on the news is mainly the case that was brought on by South Africa and the ICJ, and I think we're going to touch a bit about that later on. So I'm sure you're all anxious to hear from our analyst. I'm going to introduce the first speaker, who is Sanet Solomon. Sanet Solomon is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of South Africa and a political analyst. She's an internationally published author, double cum laude graduate, member of the International Golden Key Honor Society, and PhD candidate in the Center for Gender and Africa Studies at the University of the Free State in South Africa. She's currently serving as the council member of the South African Association of Political Studies, IAPSS Africa Regional Chair, and Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the IAPSS Politicon. She's also a member of the International Political Science Association and British International Studies Association. She serves as a reviewer for numerous double-blind peer reviews, accredited journals, and she's frequently on the news in South Africa to cover the political developments. Sanet, I hand over the floor to you, and we are all very anxious to hear your assessment of the coming elections on Wednesday. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you again for having me. I'll briefly switch on my camera so that you just have an idea of who's speaking. And then I'm just going to keep my audio on and then share my screen, if that's okay. All right, awesome again. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to try to do something which is quite difficult in a very restricted amount of time. So I'm going to reflect on 30 years of democracy in a few slides. Okay, so in order for you to have a context in terms of what happens in South Africa, it's always important to take our context into consideration. So as many of you know, South Africa had its first democratic elections in 1994, and these elections resulted in the African National Congress taking office. One of the interesting things about democratic South Africa is that it inherited a racially skewed public service, which predominantly consisted of 95.5% white South Africans, 0.6% Black South Africans, and those 0.6 people generally occupied the lower ranks of government, and this becomes important at a later stage. The democratic government also inherited a population that was widely unskilled. It lacks access to education, healthcare, and other basic services. And this also meant that it was tasked with creating an economy which then benefit all of its citizens. So as the new government came in, it had to obviously redress some of the challenges that we experienced. And as a result of that, we saw these rights in terms of the South African context being embedded in terms of our constitution. And this included obviously service access, a radically reformed economic and public sector, as well as the funding of a lot of service delivery programs. And all of this becomes important when we're looking at the context in terms of 2024. So during this time, where we had the transition from your apartheid state towards a democratic state, there was obviously a number of public servants that decided to leave the public service through the introduction of a voluntary severance packages, and this started in 1996. As a result of this, a lot of skilled workers started leaving the public service, and we started seeing people of color occupying those spaces. But similarly, we had the newly elected government, which was the African National Congress at the time, also having members from members returning from exile, and most of them were obviously inexperienced in terms of governance matters because they didn't have any previous experience governing. So one of the biggest tasks that the ANC had was the task of transforming itself from a liberation movement into a pragmatic party that would be able to rule the country. And here we saw it obviously binding with the tripartite alliance, which would consist of the South African Communist Party, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and then the ANC. But one of the bigger challenges is that these broad coalitions obviously resulted in diverse and opposing views, having to find a way to balance themselves in order for you to have what would be a governing party. In 2015, we started seeing major revelations in terms of scandals in South Africa's public service, and this incorporated institutions such as your Eskom, the South African Airways, and others. And over time, we also saw linkages back to as early as 2010, where there was a collusion between construction companies and the state for the 2010 World Cup. And obviously, with time, corruption would become an integral part of South African politics, and this would be a means of attaining political influence, and it would obviously then affect the effectiveness of state institutions, which is a big challenge. In April 2024, we celebrated 30 years of democracy in South Africa under our 6th administration, and this is obviously a momentous achievement for such a young democracy. So while there are a lot of things to celebrate in terms of post-apartheid South Africa, there's also a lot of ambiguity in terms of how people receive these achievements. So the political results from this transition are obviously visible as we enjoy broad legitimacy, opposition parties are tolerated at every sphere of government, and obviously our constitution enjoys great respect around the world. I sincerely apologize for this. It's unfortunately election time, so my phone is perpetually ringing. So the political results from the transition are visible as we enjoy broad legitimacy. Opposition parties are tolerated at every sphere of government, and our constitution, enjoys great respect around the world. So while many South Africans obviously hoped that this political freedom would also lead to social and economic freedom, this has unfortunately not been the case. So over the past 30 years, many people's lives have remained unchanged, and many argue that there's a mismatch between the expectations and the reality that has been visible since 2024 or 2004. And this has obviously resulted in an increase in terms of service delivery protests, as well as the levels of militancy that are also, or the levels of militancy that is often associated with these public demonstrations. And this was visible during the 2021 July riots. Recent surveys that were conducted found that South Africa wasn't performing very well in terms of a range of social, economic, and governance measures. And these surveys, in short, showed that we have had a deterioration over the past 12 years. And this is more than any other country that is not at war. So when looking at the context that we find ourselves in, we found that there's been a mismatch between education and the skills needed in terms of the South African context. We find that 95% of the South African workforce has a literacy rate, but only 10% of that workforce is proficient in English. And this is obviously a challenge, as English is the business language in terms of South Africa. When we look at the trends in terms of international maths and sciences, we find that South Africa ranks very low in terms of these different rankings, even on the African continent, despite the country allocating billions towards its education services and social welfare. And then the country's economic growth has decreased since 2008, and this has not obviously been well received, as the country hasn't been able to grow beyond a rate of 4 to 5%. And as a result, you also see an increase in terms of migrating to other parts of the world. It is estimated that 25,000 people leave the country annually, and this basically means that or 25,000 people have left the country, and this means that we have an annual departure rate of 1,000 to 2,000 of the most wealthiest people. So in terms of the South African healthcare, this has also been quite challenging, as the former Minister of Health has indicated that the public health facilities are operating below the required standards. And this is obviously like quite a big problem. There's also been an increase in the number of murders as well as sexual offenses, as disclosed by the statistics provided by the police over the past decade. And this is between 2008 and 2018. The country's economic growth rate was 1.4%, but what was interesting was that in 2023, we didn't even have a growth rate of 1%, and there was a possibility that the country could have gone in a near recession. In 2018, more than 50% of the country's citizens lived in poverty, while only 20% could be classified as middle class and 4% as the elite. Again, we saw that the start of that decline in terms of the economy started intensifying around the time in 2019, and we still see these figures progressing as we move forward. In terms of the South African context, there's also a lot of disparities, especially with regards to education, skills, as well as income. And despite all of these challenges, the African National Congress has still managed to remain in control of the national government since 1994, and we also saw this obviously in the last national election. But despite this, we've seen a decline in terms of our voter turnout, where we've moved from having percentages in the 80s, I believe it was 84% in 1994, to now having a voter turnout of 66% in the last election, which is something that was quite concerning. And one of the most challenging things about this is that you struggle to consolidate yourself as a democracy if there isn't a very low or if there isn't a very high voter turnout. So I guess one of the most important questions to cover in terms of this discussion is what to expect from 2024 and the 2024 elections, and how they differ from the other national elections that we've had. So in the South African context, for a very long time, only political parties could participate in terms of our national elections, but this has unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but fortunately changed over time. So we have moved beyond a space where you have only political parties participating in the national elections, but you've also had the introduction of independent candidates in terms of our elections, and this obviously puts a spanner in the works. I believe to date we have 11 independent candidates, and today actually marks the first day of our elections, as we've had special votes starting at 9 a.m. this morning. An additional change that has occurred is obviously the introduction of 3 instead of 2 ballots, and then obviously the move in terms of people voting in the area where they are staying. But one of the biggest challenges in terms of the current election is the anticipation of possible coalitions. So in the past, the ANC has managed to secure votes above 50%, but a lot of polls conducted suggest that the ANC may dip from anywhere between 51% to 40%, and this obviously changes the dynamics in terms of our current demographics in terms of our politics. And this raises an interesting question also about the different kind of coalitions that we might see. In terms of the different provinces that we have, the highly contested provinces would obviously be KwaZulu-Natal, which is the second biggest registration block in terms of the elections, and then also Gauteng. But what has been significant about KwaZulu-Natal is that over the past 5 years, I believe there have been either 4 or 5 different premiers, and this has obviously had a huge impact in terms of service delivery. Over the past few months, since I believe it was the 16th of December 2023, the former president Jacob Zuma announced that he would be campaigning for a new party called the Mkhonto Party, or the MK Party. And what is significant about this political party is that the former president used to be a member of the MK during its time in the ANC, and then this party was also, their existence was announced on the anniversary of the initial MK, and that obviously sparked a lot of legal debates and also legal challenges that I'm sure a lot of the people in the audience have been following quite closely. So with the by-elections taking place in terms of the South African context, we've also seen that the MK party has been growing substantively, and as a result causing possible challenges for the African National Congress in terms of that area. With the passing of the Zulu leader from the IFP, Prince Buthelezi, we've also seen that there has been a decrease in support for the IFP, despite the fact that they've been trying to reform and restructure that political party. And as a result, there's a lot of polls suggesting that the MK party might grow quite substantively in terms of KZN, either resulting in them leading KZN and or them having the second largest number of votes in terms of that province. And what that raises is an interesting question about whether it will be willing to collaborate with the African National Congress, and or whether the African National Congress will have to be competing with their longtime rivals, which is the IFP. In terms of Gauteng, we've seen the emergence of quite a number of political parties, which has also changed the dynamics. you have like the rise of the Patriotic Alliance, Action SA, and also Rise Mzansi. What is fascinating about Rise Mzansi is that it often appeals more to members of the youth, which is in South African context, anyone between the ages of 15 to 35. So that tends to be the demographic. And what is interesting is that's the exact same demographic that normally votes for a younger party such as the Economic Freedom Fighters, also referred to as the EFF. Secondly, what is also happening in terms of Gauteng is, given that these other political parties are also growing in terms of their numbers and support, this also raises an interesting question in terms of who will be taking the lead in terms of the Gauteng province. When looking at the Western Cape, which I believe is either the third or the fourth largest registration block, we also see a number of challenges and a number of changes. Predominantly in the past, the Democratic Alliance has enjoyed a majority of votes and support in terms of the Western Cape, but we've seen this declining due to a number of changes that they've made. And this is obviously contributed towards their stance in terms of the Israel-Palestine issue. But we also see this in terms of their increase in terms of the rates and taxes, which have become quite unaffordable to the people living in your middle to lower income areas. And as a result of these decisions and the governance changes, we obviously see other parties stepping in and then obviously filling that gap. So in the Western Cape, what may happen is that the DA might then obviously lose the vote of your non-Caucasian groupings due to a number of the policies and or changes. So it's just worth mentioning that over the past few years, the DA hasn't mentioned to retain many of its leaders of colors, and this has obviously caused a lot of concern for voters who are people of color. And this raises questions about whether or not they are welcome in this political party or whether or not that is not the case. But it is also worth mentioning that this party, despite its challenges in terms of presenting itself as a multi-party organization, is actually a multi-party organization with quite a diverse following. Secondly, what has also been happening is that the DA has been losing, or there's a possibility of them possibly losing the colored vote to other political parties such as your Patriotic Alliance, Action SA, and more recently, I would say, the Good Party. And what this would suggest is that they would have a reduced support in terms of that colored vote that generally used to boost them in terms of the Western Cape. And moreover, we also see that the stance in terms of the Israel-Palestine issue may result in other political parties, like, for example, the Al-Jamaa, the Good Party, and the Patriotic Alliance, then absorbing those Cape Malay or the Cape Malay vote in terms of that region. So in terms of the South African context, there's been a lot of changes that have been taking place. And at the moment, there are a lot of people have different suggestions. The Ipsos poll from the 6th of, I think it was released around the 6th of December 2023, suggested that there was a possibility that the Economic Freedom Fighters could become the official opposition, but this was obviously prior to the introduction of the MK Party, which has also changed the political dynamics in terms of the country. So possible solutions or possible outcomes for the coming elections could be that the African National Congress could have a reduced majority, and or they could dip between 40 to 51%, which may mean that they would have to obviously pair with like-minded political parties. And many analysts suggest that these could be smaller political parties that would have it still maintain that majority in terms of parliament and also the coalitions which they rule. Secondly, is possible fears about.
I just wanna just 1 second, because is the slide is not going forward, so do we still need it, or do you still need the?
No, we don't need it.
Okay.
Let me just stop it.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, and then so the other possibility is that we might see a coalition which could consist of possible DA with other smaller parties, which is referred to as your moonshot pack. But recent polls suggest that this pack may not get more than 30% of the vote in terms of the South African context, which obviously changes the dynamics in terms of the country. So I guess my concluding thoughts is that at this point, there's no certainty in terms of what South Africans may vote for, but there has generally been a shift in terms of the voting dynamics and what people choose to vote for. And things that have been coming through in terms of interactions with the different stakeholders and different voters on the ground is that people would like to see more pragmatic solutions in terms of the South African context. There's been a push for better governance. There's been a push for better service delivery. There's been a push for increased and improved healthcare, professionalizing the public service, and so on. So as we prepare for the outcomes, which will most probably be ready by either the end of this week, it raises a lot of interesting questions about what may happen and whether we will be able to see possible coalitions being formed within that 2-week period after the results have been announced, should there be no definite winner. And I guess that's where I'll be stopping my presentation for today. Thank you again.
Thank you, Sanet. Since I don't see any questions in the chat, I did want to kind of sum up. I mean, would you say you characterize a shift from kind of identity politics to kind of more of a result-based and utilities-based voting pattern? And if that is a correct way to sum up kind of the trend you're seeing? Go ahead.
No, sorry, please continue.
Go ahead.
Okay, you do see it, but it depends on which context you're looking at. If you are looking at your metro vote in terms of Gauteng, there is a possibility that voters would go for more pragmatic voter basis, etc. If you do look, unfortunately, at KZN, it is predominantly ethnic based, it is predominantly cultural and traditionally based, and as a result of that, your biggest key role players would obviously be the IFP, the ANC, and then the MK party. But one of the things that has also been quite interesting is that the support that the ANC has enjoyed has obviously reduced due to their ability to deal with that region. And like, I'm not sure if you know, there were recent floods in terms of KZN. And despite these floods, there's still not enough economic development, there's not enough support for those communities, and so on. So that's why those communities are now reverting and going back to support the MK party in hopes that they would actually be able to resolve those challenges, given that most of the people who form part of the MK are actually from that region.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'll move on to the next speaker, and if there are any other questions, we'll be, I think, take it in the end, so we'll give enough time for everyone. Sorry, I'm on mute. Okay, sorry. 1 second. So I'm moving now to Joshua Meservey. He's a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, where he studies great power competition in Africa, African geopolitics, and counterterrorism. He is a returned Peace Corps volunteer who served in Zambia before working for a refugee resettlement NGO based in Kenya. He has also worked at the U.S. Army Special Operations Command at the Atlantic Council Africa Center and as a research fellow for Africa at the Heritage Foundation. He has testified 7 times before Congress and once before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and is a frequent commentator on Africa policy issues in a range of print and digital media outlets. He has a master's degree from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a bachelor from Templeton Honors College at Eastern University. Joshua, thank you so much for joining us, and I hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiri, and thank you to the Institute, the Israel African Institute, for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to join you. So my task today is to speak about South Africa's foreign policy, and I have the same challenge that my colleague did, who preceded me, which is to discuss a very complex and large issue in a short amount of time. So I'm going to move quickly. I will obviously have to skip over some important elements, but I'll ask your indulgence beforehand for that, given the time constraints, and hopefully we can get into anything that I missed in Q&A and discussion. So I want to preface my remarks by noting that I'm going to be talking about the ANC and the South African government somewhat interchangeably. They are technically different, obviously. So the African National Congress, of course, is, as my colleague just explained, the liberation movement that led the fight against apartheid. It is the party that still dominates South African politics, although part of what makes this election so interesting is that dominance is now under question. And then the South African government, of course, is the government of the country of South Africa. But again, I'm going to use them interchangeably because the ANC does dominate the South African government. All of the senior leadership of the South African government are ANC, with very few exceptions, but all the way up to President Cyril Ramaphosa, who also leads the ANC. And then I think you can look at ANC ideology and doctrine and see its very clear effect on South African government policy. So I just wanted to preface my remarks by noting that I do acknowledge ANC and the South African government are different, but I'm still going to use them interchangeably here. So South Africa's foreign policy, unsurprisingly, is profoundly shaped by its history, its very recent history, particularly the history of fighting apartheid. And the ruling ANC believes that the problems that still plague South Africa are a result of this legacy and damage done by the apartheid system. It's very clear in their documents. That's their fundamental analysis of what has gone wrong within South African society. So ever since it came to power in 1994, the fulcrum point of its domestic agenda has been undoing that damage caused by apartheid. Now, this manifests in its concepts, its sort of broad strategic concepts like the National Democratic Revolution, which is a program for achieving what the ANC terms, this is from a 2005 ANC document, a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, united, and prosperous society. And growing out from that are a variety of government programs like Black economic empowerment, concepts like land expropriation, the massive social grant schemes that, again, my colleague referenced earlier. So how this applies to foreign policy is the link that the ANC draws between the domestic ills that are caused by this legacy of apartheid and the structural global ills that undermine the fight within the domestic context within South Africa. So the ANC believes that overcoming the legacy of apartheid and patriarchy and racism that they believe are at the root of South Africa's problems require eradicating those problems everywhere, all across the globe. So famously, this is a quote that's been getting used a lot recently. Nelson Mandela in 1997 said, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." Now, the rest of that quote is, without the resolution of conflicts in East Timor, the Sudan, and other parts of the world. That's the whole quote. So that's a very clear distillation of this idea that the South Africans at home are not truly free until the ills that they perceive, that the ANC perceives in the world, have been eradicated. And I'll give you a few other quotes from sort of seminal ANC and South African government documents to underscore this point. So in 1955, the Freedom Charter was promulgated. This was written by a coalition of South African opposition groups, and it was essentially their vision for what South Africa should look like. Within that document, they said, South Africa shall strive to maintain world peace and the settlement of all international disputes by negotiation, not war. Peace and friendship amongst all its people, all of South Africa's people, shall be secured by upholding the equal rights, opportunities, and status of all, meaning all people everywhere. So this is the ambition, and there's many other examples of this type of thinking that I could offer. So the same ills that continue to plague South Africa domestically, against which South Africa must fight, manifest themselves globally as structural forces like neo-racism, neo-colonialism, and neoliberal economic policies. According to the ANC's understanding of the world, those are the forces that obstruct South Africa's and the global South's ability to develop and enjoy equal power and status internationally. I'll give you one quick quote here from a 2022 ANC document. The growing challenges of poverty, unemployment, inequality, underdevelopment, conflict, and environmental degradation are the direct outcome of failures of the neoliberal international system. So that brings us to an obvious question. Who created this system? And therefore, from the South African perspective, who must be resisted and what must be reformed? So the perpetrators of the neo-racist, neo-colonial, neoliberal policies that keep the global South down, that obstruct its ability to develop, is the wealthy, domineering global North, essentially the West. I'll give you an ANC document. A new era has dawned whose main content is, inter alia, the ever-growing conflict between a highly industrialized and affluent North and an impoverished, underdeveloped, highly populated South. And jumping forward a little bit, we believe that Africa is once again the victim of a new and grossly unjust global system. And jumping ahead again, South Africa stands firmly as a country of the South. So South Africa is explicitly, or the ANC is explicitly saying, the country that we lead is a member of the global South that is part of this victimized class of countries all around the world that are victimized by the global North. Now, within this global South and global North struggle, there's a particularly problematic country. Well, there's actually several, and I'll get to another one shortly. But perhaps the primary problematic country is the United States, because it is the leader of the West. It is the leader of this global North system that is unjust, and it was the chief architect of some of the structural injustices that the ANC sees, things like the Bretton Woods system, for instance. So here's some excerpts from a 2007 ANC document that references the unique dominance of one hyperpower. That's the reference to the United States, of course. The document then goes on to reference alliances around one hyperpower whose dominance is reminiscent of empires of a bygone era. And then later on, in many respects, the current global balance is evocative of the situation in previous eras of dominant empires and colonialism, when brute force was the currency of geopolitical intercourse. And then a little bit later in the document, there's a final reference to the rapacious license of empire. So that's a pretty clear articulation of the ANC's perspective on both the United States and the system of alliances that surround the US. So to fight this global battle that is necessary and critical to achieving the ANC's domestic goals, the ANC aligns with what it calls the Progressive International Revolutionary Movement. That phrase of art is found somewhat regularly in its policy documents. The goal of this movement, and this is a quote that's used several times in ANC policy documents, including 2015 and a March 2023 document just last year. The goal of the movement is to liberate humanity from the bondage of imperialism and neocolonialism. There are two core tools that the ANC perceives as critical to this global battle. Those are Pan-Africanism and South-South solidarity. It is by uniting with other African countries and other non-African developing countries that South Africa will defeat the oppressive structural global forces that feed into South Africa's internal problems and block the revolution that the ANC began in 1912, which was the formation of the ANC. This is from a 2011 white paper, and bear with me, these are a little bit lengthier quotes, but I think they're important to get. So this is, as I said, a 2011 white paper. This is a South African government document. South Africa's evolving international engagement is based on two central tenets, namely Pan-Africanism and South-South solidarity. South Africa recognizes itself as an integral part of the African continent and therefore understands its national interest as being intrinsically linked to Africa's stability, unity, and prosperity. Likewise, the 1955 Bandung Conference shapes our understanding of South-South cooperation and opposition to colonialism as a natural extension of our national interest. Now, again, that's 2011. So sort of formal colonialism has been eradicated all around the globe, but it still remains a central sort of preoccupation of the South African government and the ANC. This is from a 2022 South African government framework document, foreign policy framework document. South Africa's international engagement extends beyond the SADC, which is the regional grouping that South Africa is in, and Africa to encompass solidarity, cooperation, and partnership with countries and institutions of the South. Skipping ahead, both the political and economic imperatives were taken into consideration as we continued to advance the cause of the people of South Africa and the African continent by way of South-South strategic partnerships. This consistency continues to date, and a redoubling of the country's efforts is the only way to overcome the lingering vestiges of colonialism and racial oppression on the African continent and the global South. Okay, I'm belaboring the ideology point and boring everybody with long quotes because I think you can draw.
Actually, people are saying that the quotes are interesting and they would love to see them on the presentation, but I don't know if you could share. Okay.
Yeah, this we can figure it out. Maybe we can distribute it to
okay,
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm so focused on the ideology because I think you can draw a very direct line from that ideology to the foreign policy choices that South Africa makes. In fact, I think that South Africa's foreign policy choices are inexplicable unless you understand a lot, or at least some, about ANC ideology, and you can read through their documents and get a sense of their worldview. So and I'll try to draw some of those links here. Fundamentally, if the West is ganging up on a country, so to speak, from the global South, South Africa will be reflexively skeptical of that effort, because fundamentally in its worldview, the West is the victimizer and the global South is the victim. That's just the overarching sort of analytical framework that the ANC has of the world. This helps explain its long and staunch support for very problematic regimes such as in Cuba and Venezuela, very problematic movements like Polisario, PLA, and later Hamas. And then so to try to nail this down, I did a recent report, and I looked from 1994 through October 2023, which was when the last data that I had, at South Africa's voting history at the UN Human Rights Council and the commission that preceded the council. 1994 was obviously when apartheid ended. I found that South Africa was eligible to vote on 111 contested draft resolutions condemning countries' human rights violations, countries other than Israel, during this time frame. It abstained on 75 of those 111 motions, which is 68%. It voted against 17 of those motions, which is 15%, and it voted in favor of 19 of those motions, so 17%. So 83% of the time, it either abstained or voted against resolutions condemning the human rights violations of countries other than Israel. Within those votes are included abstentions on all 22 of the contested resolutions on Syria that it could have voted for. That includes resolutions that condemned things like the Syrian, the gas attacks against civilians by the Assad regime, and the whole panoply of terrible crimes that the Assad regime engaged in. Of the 12 resolutions on Iran's human rights situation on which it could vote, South Africa abstained on 11 and voted against 1. Again, within those resolutions were at least 1 and maybe 2 that came after Iranian morality police beat to death a young woman for improper veiling and then touched off a massive popular protest movement within the country. And then finally, South Africa has abstained on all 8 of the North Korea motions for which it could have voted, and it also failed to condemn the Russian invasion at the UN, or the Russian invasion of the Ukraine when it came up at the UN. Now, again, I would argue that that makes sense only if you understand how the Afghan National Congress views the world. Syria should not be condemned, even if, and I'm not suggesting that individual ANC members do not care about Syrian civilians who were slaughtered in Syria. But I think as a principled stand, the ANC simply believes that when a country like Syria, which is primarily, or a regime like Assad's, which is primarily being attacked or pursued by the West or the global North, then that calls deeply into question that campaign because of who is doing it, because the global North is doing it against a global South country. Now, I'm potentially being a little bit oversimplistic here, but I do think that's the general grounding for some of these foreign policy choices that South Africa makes. And I'll give you just a few more examples here. South Africa hosted Omar al-Bashir in 2015 when he was under ICC indictment for crimes against humanity, including genocide. They more recently, in January of this year, hosted General Hemeti, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who is the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, which is the sort of formalized security service element that grew out of the Janjaweed militias, which perpetrated the genocide for which Bashir was under indictment in 2015. Hemeti is currently overseeing an ethnic cleansing campaign in that same region of Sudan. He was received all smiles by President Cyril Ramaphosa in January this year. They've hosted the Iranian President Raisi, recently departed, for the BRICS Summit, August 2023. They would have hosted Vladimir Putin, who was also under ICC indictment at the time. In fact, when President Putin's ICC indictment was made public, South Africa threatened to withdraw from the Rome Statute, which established the ICC. They did walk that back eventually, but that was the initial reaction. Just in their immediate neighborhood, particularly during the Thabo Mbeki years, South Africa was a staunch defender of Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, who has a whole laundry list of crimes to his name, but including really violent 2008 elections where the opposition was harassed and in some cases tortured, beaten, killed. And South Africa was a prominent protector of the Mugabe regime during that time. And then I think someone else on the panel is going to talk about South Africa, Israel, but I think that's also the best way to understand South Africa and the ANC's perspective on Israel. The ANC can invoke its history of apartheid and say, well, Israel is engaging in this same type of thing, so that strengthens its denunciation of Israel as a settler colonial state. That is how the ANC refers to Israel in at least one of its policy documents. My analysis is that the ANC's goal for the case against Israel is less about protecting Gazans and more about delegitimizing and isolating Israel globally. Doing so weakens a member of the Western coalition, of this global North coalition that upholds an international system that the ANC frankly despises if you read it, their documents that are written in their own words. I'm already at time here, so I will say there are also practical reasons for some of these positions. I think domestic electoral politics plays a very prominent role, again, in the ICJ case, especially where you have a small Muslim population in South Africa that's concentrated in opposition areas in the Western Cape. And the DA, the primary opposition group, has been losing a lot of support among that community because of the Israel-Gaza conflicts, which could really affect the DA's electoral prospects. You also, there's sort of Cold War nostalgia where the USSR was a staunch ANC supporter for years, and the apartheid government was closer to the West, so I think there's lingering resentment there from the ANC. There's also, I think, again, on the electoral front, with these elections coming, I think the ANC may well be trying to distract the population from its disastrous record on managing the country. And again, there's a few others and that I think are relevant, but my fundamental premise is that unless you understand this ideology and the way the ANC views the world, you cannot understand South Africa's foreign policy choices. I'll leave it there. Again, I had to skip over a lot and move quickly, but hopefully we can get to it in Q&A if I missed anything.
Joshua, thank you so much. I think the message about the relations between ideology and the foreign policy is very clear, and it's a very interesting thesis, and I would love to hear the other panelists what they say about it before we conclude. There are some fascinating questions. Well, I think we will get to them after our next speaker. So I would like to present Dr. Asher Lubotzky, who's Israeli, but is sitting currently in Houston, Texas. Dr. Lubotzky is the Israel Institute teaching fellow at the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston. He holds a PhD in history from Indiana University, a master's degree from Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and a bachelor's degree from University of Haifa in Israel. His scholarship focuses on Africa-Israel relations, past and present, Jews in Africa and Israel's foreign policy and global image. He's currently working on a book entitled Before the Apartheid Denology, South African Radicals and Israel/Palestine, 1940s till the 1970s. His work has also been published in the Jewish Historical Studies, South African Historical Journal, the Journal of the Middle East and Africa, and Israel Studies, among others. He's also publishes commentary and policy papers for various international venues, such as The Conversation, The Republic, and The Strategic Assessment. Dr. Lubotzky is also a visiting fellow researcher in the Israel-Africa Institute. Dr. Lubotzky, please.
Right. Thank you very much for being here and for this fascinating webinar. Yes, so I'm going to talk about Israel and South Africa. I'm going to talk about history, but also about current affairs. History is very important. It's more than just anecdotes and a nice story. It's very important. As Joshua also said, it really affects the way the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa, sees the world, okay? And history is a huge part in the way they see Israel and the way they see the Palestinians. So we're going to talk about this now. It's actually a pretty interesting history. And the second half will be of my talk. I'll talk about more current things. All right, so first, before I'm starting to talk about the chronology and diplomatic history, I want to say something that is to highlight a factor that is very important in the relations between South Africa and Israel. Otherwise, those two countries are very far from, right, distant from each other. There are not many mutual interests involved, but there is a Jewish connection, and historically the Jewish connection was very important in the ways that Israel behaved towards South Africa and vice versa. Maybe to some extent, it's also similar to what is going on with the United States. You have the relations between Israel and the United States, right? But the fact that there is a huge and pretty wealthy Jewish community in the United States also affect those relations. So here in South Africa, we also saw it historically. A relatively large Jewish community that was relatively very wealthy and very Zionist. The number one in the world in contribution per capita to Israel since 1948. So this was something that brought the countries together. But at the same time, we need to understand that this Jewish connection is really, in the last few decades, is really being dwindling. And the peak of Jewish South Africa was in the 60s and 70s when we counted over 100,000 Jews in South Africa. And now in recent years, there was a recent account that only it came to the conclusion that only 50,000 Jews remain in South Africa. And this really matters, also because of electoral politics, right? And also because other bonds that bind the countries together. So this is an important thing to acknowledge and understand before we delve in. All right, so during apartheid, right, apartheid was established in 1948, actually in the same month that the State of Israel was established. But during apartheid, Israel had a dilemma diplomatically. On the one hand, Israel had a lot to gain from relations with the government, with South African government. The South African government allowed South African Jews to transfer money to Israel. The South African government was a relatively strong country back then, stronger than Israel, had a relatively strong military, strong military complex, like industrial complex. South Africa is, as we all know, is a land rich of resources. So Israel had some kind of national interest to have some relations with the government of South Africa, the white government, right? The white minority rule in South Africa. So that was on the one end. But on the other hand, Israel, since the late 50s, had a very energetic pro-African diplomacy on the continent in Africa, right? And it included aiding liberation movements all across Africa to end colonialism and African nation building. So in the 60s, there was what we call in the scholarship the honeymoon between Israel and Africa. So Israel couldn't really, ally itself with the white rule regime. So there was always this dilemma in Israeli foreign policy. What should we do regarding South Africa? And at least this caricature here, the cartoon, is I think very reflective of the time. It was from the early 60s, right? This is representing of Israel. And what do I choose? Do I choose the Jews of South Africa, all considered white, right? And the South African government, or do we choose our relations with Africa and our values that are anti-racist and so on, right? So in the 60s, it tilted to this side, to the pro-African side. So indeed, in the 60s, Israel sided with the African, in South Africa too, with the Black Africans, right? It was the first Western country. Israel by then was already totally identifying with the West, right? And I'm talking about the early 60s. And yet at the UN, Israel went out of the Western camp and joined the communist camp and the so-called third world camp and the Arab states too, and voted for sanctions against South Africa. That was 1962, but also in other years at the UN in the 60s. So that was this. Then Israel also reduced level of representation in Pretoria and applied some of the sanctions, never fully, but some of the sanctions were implemented. And Israel supported very secretly, that's actually my dissertation is about, very secretly, some various anti-apartheid movements and individuals. I bring this photo here because this is Zalman Shazar, Israel's president at the time, and the woman here on the edge is a representative of the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, a very militant anti-apartheid movement, and she was in Israel. Okay, so there were connections between anti-apartheid movements and Israel in the 60s. And then things changed. After the war, the Six-Day Wars in 1967, then after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel is becoming isolated in Africa. That was true especially after 73. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War, most African states severe relations with Israel, partially under Arab pressure, especially Saudi Arabia and the oil embargoes that we all know. And Israel is isolated in Africa. There are no more, besides very relatively marginal states. Israel does not have any presence anymore after 73 in Africa. And this one thing, by the way, it's kind of, I think the time, the 1973 and 2023-24, Yom Kippur and October 7 remind us there's some common similarities here. So one of the things that Israel was growingly isolated in the international sphere. The other common thing, I think, that Israel has realized, Israeli leadership had realized that Israel needs now to develop local military industry, because during the Yom Kippur War, Israel, it was clear now to Israel, to Israel and to the world that Israel is highly dependent on American military supplies. And of course, Kissinger and all the airlift that we all know during the Yom Kippur War, this was something that in the end, after the war, Yitzhak Rabin and others, Shimon Peres and others in the Israeli leadership understood that Israel now really needs to invest in local military industry, okay? So those things, on one hand, international isolation, and the other hand, the need to develop military industry, brought Israel closer again to the white minority rule in South Africa. At that time, the white minorities rule, I'm talking about like early 70s, right, seemed very powerful. It wasn't estimated that they were going to collapse anytime. They seemed pretty powerful. They were, it seemed like they successfully oppressed the anti-apartheid opposition, resistance. And Israel, again, Israel is now isolated from other African countries, so it went with the countries that seemed to be friendly to it and was very willing to do business with Israel. South Africa at the time was very powerful, but also very desperate because international pressure was piling up, and South Africa was desperate to find able allies that would deal with it and develop maybe things together. So South Africa had the resources, right? Because they had the money still because of the resources that are in South Africa. It's a pretty rich country, right? And Israel had the know-how, but not so much money. And in the 70s, you have this alliance being forged between South Africa with its money and resources, and Israel with its with the engineers and the technology and the know-how and the innovation maybe coming together. And those two countries formed in the 70s and the 80s a very strong alliance. Some people even said one of the most intimate alliances in the Israeli history, that even included some nuclear aspects. Okay, so Israel shared some nuclear technologies with South Africa apparently, and that was, of course, that we don't know that Israel did it with any other country, or very few at least. So that was a intimate relationship, okay? And this is what the ANC remembers, okay? At the same time, the ANC was forging, you know, that was, we are mirroring it, right? So Israel went with the apartheid regime, and the ANC was getting very close with the PLO. The PLO, and if you notice, the 70s and the 80s was a parallel time for both organizations. It paralleled the PLO and the ANC both worked in exile, both internationalized their struggles, right? Their cause, sanctions. Some of you remember the UN deciding that Zionism is racism, right? 1975. So it all came together. You found yourself, if you listen to UN resolutions in the 70s and 80s, South Africa and Israel were the same sentence in all those condemnations and calling for sanctions. Of course, it was way harsher towards South Africa, but it was kind of those kind of struggles merged together, morphed together, and the ANC. It was also on an operative level. Training and stuff like this, both organizations worked together. Okay, it was in exile. Probably some ANC operatives trained in Lebanon in the 70s by the PLO at the time. So this alliance is very deep and stretched back to the early 70s. And also that's something that Joshua mentioned. For the ANC, the Palestinian cause seemed very similar. Okay, it's more than just like the same timing, the same enemy, or Israel and South Africa, but it seemed to them on the principle, right, very similar. It resonated with them, right? It was according to their narrative, right? It was indigenous against settlers, apartheid that was involved in both cases, occupation. South Africa occupied Namibia for a few decades, right? US-backed regimes, right? Global North, right? As Joshua said. So it all made sense to see, and the PLO became one of the key allies. They were both supported by Soviet Union and so on. Okay. All right. So apartheid ended 1994, and we have the Mandela administration, and during that time, that was also the Oslo era, right, in the 90s, and this, because probably it was the Oslo era, South Africa is not the new South Africa. Post-apartheid South Africa, democratic South Africa, did not become a super anti-Israel as we see now. It tried to keep some kind of balance. Peace was maybe in the prospects, and Mandela wanted to balance. Of course, he said, there is also the quote that Joshua mentioned, he was very committed, Mandela himself was very committed to the Palestinian cause, but he also developed pretty strong relations with Israel, or at least very correct relations with Israel. He visited Israel in the 1999, sorry, and so there were relations, and there was some kind of a balance. And Mandela even says in 93, he said, we insist on the right of the state of Israel to exist within secure borders, but with equal vigor support the Palestinian right to national self-determination, right? So this kind of very Oslo-y two-state solution language. All right, so that was in the 90s. Now, since the 2000s, there is a gradual deterioration in relations between Israel and South Africa, and South Africa has been drifting away from even the PLO, from the PA, right, towards stronger and stronger relations with direct relations even with Hamas. Some facts about this is that South Africa has had contacts with Hamas for at least a decade, direct contacts. Hamas has a funding network operating uninterruptedly in South Africa. In 2012, the ANC officially adopts a BDS resolution. This every year or two they repeat and reaffirm the same resolution, but they already did it in 2012. Arguably, maybe that's the first non-Muslim right ruling party that does such thing. That's pretty early on in the game. And since around this time, there are no official visits, maybe a few years later, no official visits really between South Africa and Israel, especially not on the South African side. In 2018, South Africa, that was the time when President Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. There were the defense, right, the riots at the fence organized by Hamas. South Africa recalled its ambassador because of these tensions in Gaza, and never to really come back. And officially the representation level, the diplomatic representation level of South Africa and Israel was reduced, was demoted already in early 2023, before the current war, right? So it wasn't even supposed to be an ambassador, but something lower than that. And in 2022, South Africa was one of the main reasons why Israel was excluded, was kicked out, essentially, from the African Union. Just only 1 year after Israel kind of restored its observer status in the African Union, South Africa and Algeria together ganged up and succeeded in managed to get Israel out, kick it out from the African Union. So I'm just also saying that to show that South Africa is diplomatically on the continent is a pretty powerful country. So we can do, and its policies against Israel can also affect in other areas of the continent, right? All right, so just like a few words about trade. So that was politically what I talked about. Now, trade with South Africa was going pretty much normally, at least until recently, at least until the war, it went pretty normally. The last official numbers that we have is from 2021. 30% of Israel's trade with Africa, with the continent, is with South Africa, right? You see the numbers, Israel exports more than imports from South Africa. It's nice numbers, but they are not extremely high at all, right? Israel, for example, Israel exports 0.4% of its exports to South Africa, okay? And the recommendations, the Israeli Ministry of Economy, right, of Trade and Economy, see potential. This is from a formal report that they compiled. They see potential in South Africa's agricultural, communication, cyber, and mine sectors for Israeli companies. Again, that was before the war. Now it's going to be way more complicated. Now, since October 7. So the initial reaction of the South African government was, you can read it on the right here, was pretty exceptional in its tilt against Israel. This is a reaction on October 7, right, when Hamas troops were still inside Israel and fighting was still going on. South Africa pretty much blamed Israel. Did not even name Hamas, did not even name what Hamas has done, was still doing, right? Only expressed some grave concern over the recent devastating escalation, right? But didn't say who made the escalation, who did it, right? And then they went on and blamed Israel for all the crisis in the region. That the phone call with Ania, okay? The South African Minister for International Relations, right, and Cooperation, the Foreign Affairs Minister, in other words, had the phone call with Ania, all right? Ania, Hamas claims that they showed solidarity with Hamas. The South Africans said it wasn't really solidarity, but yeah, but they did have a phone call. They didn't have a phone call with the Israeli right counterpart. In early November, South Africa recalled the remaining South African diplomats in Israel. They called them back to South Africa. That was the first African country to do so. Only 2 African countries ever done it, right? South Africa and Chad. But South Africa was the first one to do it. By late November, we already had the Hamas officials visiting South Africa. It's some kind of invitation by the ANC, not officially, not a state invitation, but the ANC invited them. So there were Hamas officials walking around somewhere in Cape Town, probably in South Africa. Since late December, we have the genocide case, right? The accusation of genocide at the ICJ. Here, experts say that it looks, by the language that the South Africans use, it looks like that was really written by the Palestinian authority or the Palestinian kind of foreign ministry that the PA has, and the South Africa made some touches, but in the end, it was taking the Palestinian claim and filing it almost as is to the court. And we still hear, of course, news about this, most recently about the Rafah operation. There are other things that happened recently that cabinet ministers started calling the universities in light of the encampments here in America, right, and in other places by students. Cabinet ministers in South Africa urged the students and the universities to do the same. Okay, so it's kind of top down, not really bottom up like maybe it's happening here in America. It's top down. The South African government is really trying to also escalate, let's say. Of course, it has some popular support, but we'll talk about the popular support in a bit. It's really top down in the South African case. All right, so this is something that is, I think, important for us to understand. So South Africa is obviously one of the most hostile countries, especially outside of a country that is not Muslim in the end, right? One of the most hostile countries in the world to Israel. But the question is, are there any different voices in South Africa? And the answer is yes, there are. If we look first, and my colleagues talked about this before, the DA, right, the main opposition, does have support in Western Cape. The DA itself, the Democratic Alliance, the party that after October 7 condemned Hamas. Clearly, most South African Jews, for example, vote for the DA. It is, I would say, probably in terms of Israel, right, it's closer to the more Western mainstream, right, in terms that it does condemn Hamas and generally supports Israel. So they have some kind of a stronger lead. They are, according, of course, as we saw, they poll at around 20-something%. We'll see in a few days how much they really get. But there is the main opposition party is in the end, at least anti-Hamas. Another thing here in the middle that you need to see, and this is just an example. There are not many polls in South Africa about this, but sometimes every few years you can find something. And here, this is a question about how much do you think that Israel is an apartheid state? Okay, that was asked in October and November. It's probably they started the poll before October 7, but they ended it after October 7. And they found that it's maybe hard for you to see, but if you look just at the black column here, right, here and here, they found that 29% of South Africans strongly agree that Israel is an apartheid state. Okay, 29%. And 24% strongly disagree. Okay, so in the end, and you have some that somewhat agree and somewhat disagree, but in the end, you see that it's pretty much with this statement specifically, it's a tie. It's pretty much equal. Maybe there is a little bit tilt to the more Israel is an apartheid state, but it's not overwhelming. It's not a landslide, right? It's not that 80 or 90% of South Africans think Israel is some kind of like an apartheid state and a monster and a bad thing. We have other polls, older ones, I'm not showing it here, other polls that show something like that. Around 40% of South Africans show some kind of sympathy towards Israel, which is maybe not the majority, but it is a large section. So there are organizations also, for example, South African Friends of Israel, which is a majorly black organization, Christian, right, in South Africa, that is very pro-Israel. Obviously, it's all around supporting Israel, and they conduct demonstrations sometimes in support of Israel. Also after October 7, you have obviously the Jewish South African community with the South African Zionist Federation that is pretty active. So there are voices that do push towards more pro-Israeli stances. They're not as strong as in the United States, maybe, or maybe other parts of Europe, but they exist. Another interesting thing about South Africa is that Christianity, especially Pentecostalism, is on the rise in South Africa. Okay, and Pentecostalism is usually associated with support for Israel, and we see it in other places of Africa, and it's on the rise. And this is pretty rare in the world right now, that some kind of, especially in Christianity, is actually growing. There are more Christians now, right? So this is also something, if you look at this, that may affect in the future how South Africa treats itself towards Israel. Some conclusions and implications of the upcoming elections. I saw someone ask about this in the Q&A, so I think this is my answer at least. So if the ANC, we'll find out soon, but if the ANC must form a coalition, as we suspect that it will, right? And it turns out, and the ANC turns to the EFF, right, or the MK, parties that are on the left, and they are generally, as far as we know, at least the EFF for sure, pretty anti-Israel, even more extreme than the ANC, then South Africa's Israel policy will likely stay the same, right? Even if the ANC does not have the 50%, even if they have coalition, but in the coalition you have EFF, so probably South Africa will keep being a very anti-Israeli state. But on the other hand, if the ANC turns to the DA to form a coalition, then, especially if the DA gains some influence over foreign policy, then maybe there will be some kind of lowering down the flames in the kind of this crisis of Israel. Anyway, another thing that we should also always consider, South African economy gains a lot from the United States, from ties in the United States. It's part of AGOA, right? The American program for African countries that allow trade benefits and stuff like that. So the American Congress can exclude South Africa from this program, and then South Africa may be undermined also economically. So the American pressure may have some role here. Okay, this is my last point, and thank you.
Thank you, Asher, so much. We have only 10 minutes left. I want to turn into a question we have for Sanet. Sanet, if you're probably still with us, right? So one of the questions we received, let me just say if I see Sanet here, is she on?
I think she left.
Okay, so I don't have Sanet. Okay, so we did have another question in the chat. 1 second, sorry. I think it was in the Q&A session. Let me see if I find it. Sorry. All right, so Joachim asked, could you explain which implications the elections could have on South Africa's affinity towards BRICS and its alliance with Vladimir Putin? I guess maybe ask Joshua to take that if possible.
Yeah, sure. It would be similar, I think, in some ways to what Dr. Lubotzky just laid out for potential how the relationship with Israel might develop or not, depending on which coalitions get formed. There's three major parties that could, if ANC falls significantly below 50%, there's three major parties that could make that gap. It would be EFF, MK, and DA, all of which we've already talked about. EFF and MK are very left-wing, especially EFF, which is sort of like an unreconstructed Marxist nationalist organization. And I think they would push the ANC even further into the embrace of BRICS and Russia, and more generally, this grouping of revisionist powers like the Irans of the world and China and et cetera. Because that would perfectly accord with the EFF's own philosophical leanings. MK would likely be similar. MK, we don't know too much about what they believe because it's very much a Jacob Zuma project. Jacob Zuma is the former president of South Africa. And he formed MK essentially as a stratagem to get back to power. It's very close to Russia, as Jacob Zuma himself was. He was trained in Russia, well, what is now Ukraine. He speaks fluent Russian. During his tenure as president of South Africa, he tried to deepen those ties as much as he possibly could, including security service ties. So I've even seen one article written by a gentleman I know a little bit who says he's seen intelligence portfolios suggesting that MK is actually a GRU operation, a Russian military intelligence operation, which is sadly plausible. I don't know if it's actually true, but it's plausible given what we know about Zuma. So I think again that would push if MK came into coalition, that would definitely push the government and the ANC much more towards Russia, even as it already is. And DA, I think, would again, as Dr. Lubotzky said, in the case of Israel relations, DA would probably have a little bit of an ameliorating effect. But a lot of that would depend on what other the coalition dynamics are going to be so interesting. So if DA goes in, which they've told me they probably wouldn't ever officially go in unless to avoid an absolute worst case scenario of EFF or MK going in. But if they went in, how much power would they have within that coalition? Which portfolios would they have? Those would all be critical questions to determine which direction the country might go.
Okay. No, I think if there are any final question, if not, we'll conclude. I just want to thank, I'll write Sanet, I separately apologize for her dropping off. I think it was very enlightening, and I want to thank the panelists for all the hard work that went into preparing this conversation. This video will be shared in our website and maybe perhaps in the JISS website as well. So thank you very much for everybody participating, listening in. And before we head off, I just want to share one last update. Let me just find it. 1 second. Hold on. Bear with me. Because we have an event on July 2nd that we want to let everybody know and save the date. It will take place also in cooperation with Jerusalem, with the GISS, with Tel Aviv University. It will happen in Tel Aviv University on July 2nd. We'll have a academic seminar and then a welcoming reception. Professor Inbar, is there anything else that you want to say before we head off? I just unmute. Okay.
We share the views that we had an interesting afternoon, and I hope the good work that was put on this event will continue between JISS and the Israel Africa Institute. And shalom to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.